everyone. Thank you so much for being here for today's webinar. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I'm very happy to have one of our own NCU faculty coming back to present today's webinar, Dr. Edward Maggio. Today, just a couple of housekeeping items before we move into his presentation about Edward Snowden, Traitor or Patriot. The chat is available, so please utilize the chat for conversation. I know that Dr. Maggio later on in his presentation will solicit you to participate in the chat. And then pop any questions that you have in the Q&A, and when there is a time that permits for us to break, we'll take questions at that time. And I think, just a brief reminder that this is being recorded and we will post it in our CTL webinar section for your future viewing reference. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Maggio.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Emily. I do appreciate it. Well, as stated, today's lecture, we're going to discuss Edward Snowden and whether his actions warrant potentially one day facing a trial for treason or potentially being pardoned and treated as a patriot for his actions. Just a quick disclaimer, as always, I always make it clear that what I say is my viewpoint only. It's not that of NCU. And certainly some of the photos we're going to use are covered under the fair use doctrine. Some of the things we're going to cover in this lecture, we'll certainly go through who is Edward Snowden and what did he do that led to him essentially staying in Russia, avoiding coming back to the United States. I'm going to play the role of a prosecutor at the federal level. We'll go through essentially the US government's reasons for why he should be tried for revealing US state secrets. I'll also give essentially a defense perspective, whether he should be treated as a whistleblower, protected for revealing constitutional violations as well as unlawful acts by our US government. And we'll have a discussion, where all of you will get to participate and voice your opinion, what you think his fate should be. But certainly we're going to get into a little more of the finer details as to what happened and why he is in Russia and what did he do and what is involved. There we go. Nothing worse than when PowerPoint freezes up on you. I do want to point out before we go a little bit further, as a starting measure here, I think it's important that we kind of discuss the relevance of this lecture. This lecture is not per se just going to be about Edward Snowden. Really, the center of this discussion is the impact of these mass surveillance programs, which Edward Snowden revealed, and how it plays into what we're dealing with now as US citizens in our daily lives, how we interact with social media, how we use technology. I think, it's important we really dive into these details, but I did get a lot of feedback from people earlier on in the NCU community asking, was I going to focus heavy on IT and computer terminology? Am I going to focus more on the intricacies of federal law? I'm going to try to walk a fine line between the two, just due to the complexity. If I don't get into the level of detail, you have further questions later on, I will provide my contact information so you can ask me more technical computer IT questions or the complex legal questions. But I will at least present this in a manner that we all, regardless of our backgrounds, will have a basic understanding what occurred, what Edward Snowden was engaging in, and hopefully based on that, we all can have a dialogue later as to what should be the outcome for Edward Snowden at this point. And I also want to point out, as I mentioned, these mass surveillance programs that Edward Snowden revealed, we're dealing with the aftermath now. And I'll give you a more recent example from a few days ago. For those that have seen this in the news, Apple has announced that they're now going to be going through any consumer who's using an iPhone. They're going to be going through all of your cloud photos to look for any signs that your content, i.e. your photos or any of your content found on the phone or cloud, are potentially signs that you are a pedophile. Now, at first, our first inkling when we kind of hear this is, and as a parent, nobody wants pedophiles on the street. We want them arrested. But when you start to dig a little bit deeper into how they're doing this, it starts to create some problems, which connects to essentially what Edward Snowden was revealing our government was doing and the cooperation between corporations and the US government. This concept that Apple is going to be trying soon, it uses a program called neural hash, excuse me. And essentially they're going to go through, take all of our photos that are uploaded to the cloud, match it against law enforcement database photos of child sex abuse. And then, if there's any connections, if there's a report issued, that then will result in a trigger warning, and in turn, law enforcement will be notified. And certainly Apple has said that, there's no way that potentially an innocent person could be jammed up by this. They even said there's a 1 in a trillion chance, but just in case, they are going to have people manually going through our photos just to make sure there's no potential problem where an innocent person faces an accusation. Now, some of you now, I see the chat room is starting to blow up a little bit. Some of you now are kind of seeing this could be a problem, even though it has a good intent to stop pedophiles and stop human trafficking and child sex abuse. There's some issues here. And probably the best feedback directly that I've seen on this is from Matthew Green from Johns Hopkins, where he works as a cryptography computer researcher. He nailed it, in my opinion, right on the head. First off, you have a personal privacy issue. As I mentioned, I'm a parent. I have a toddler who's 2.5. I have photos with him in the bathtub. I have photos with my wife and him in the bathtub. I don't know about you, but for the parents out there, I'm not really comfortable with somebody in a lab or a computer office reviewing manually my iCloud photos of my kid. If that doesn't bother you, it should, for many reasons. But also, Matthew Green pointed out, there's a weaponization aspect of this. In particular, the way this system will work, especially being automated and streamlined to a degree with some input from people manually supervising what is occurring, essentially you could send people, child sex abuse photos. You can use malware, get it onto their computer, get it onto their phone. Then in turn, that causes a trigger that they're cut off from use of their Apple account and their Apple product. And the way Matthew Green described it, this is something, for example, if you wanted to shut down political dissidents in, I don't know, a place like China, well, now essentially you could have the Chinese government send this type of content to people they're targeting, then in turn pursue them with Apple shutting them off from communication, closing their accounts. And then the added bonus, Apple will then be triggering law enforcement notifications so the government can then arrest these people. As he eloquently put, what happens when the Chinese government says, here's a list of files we want you to scan for? So essentially, this program Apple is considering in working with the US government and law enforcement, there are far-reaching complications that can come about from this. But these type of complications are ones that essentially Edward Snowden was warning us about. And that kind of segues perfectly into, let's learn about Edward Snowden directly. Who was he? Essentially, he was working for the CIA and in turn grabbed classified information from the NSA, the National Security Agency, detailing the mass surveillance operation that was taking place. His concern was essentially, and I'll get into the details in just a bit, that the actions being taken place using these programs were unconstitutional, unlawful, and essentially violations of our civil and human rights. How did he disclose this information? Essentially, leaving Hawaii, he met with reporters from The Guardian and The Washington Post in Hong Kong, gave them all the information that he had taken, and then in turn, essentially, let them be the organizations to vet and review this information as to what is relevant as a news story, what for the sake of safety and security could not be released. But in particular, the focus he wanted these reporters to know was that more than not, it was law-abiding citizens, and to be clear, not just foreign citizens, but US citizens whose information was essentially being gathered in mass. Now, what does that entail? Essentially, we're talking about, for those that have followed the story, this is largely under the PRISM program, in which our government, in conjunction with Apple, Facebook, Google, was spying on audio, video, photographs, emails, documents, connection logs. I'll even provide you in just a little bit about, in a given day, over 600 phone calls could be monitored. And again, this is including US citizens, even though the program was intended for non-US citizens, non-US personnel to be essentially under a surveillance program. He ended up, fleeing to Hong Kong. He was charged with theft of government property under the Espionage Act, unauthorized communication, national defense information, willful communication of classified communications intelligence, and we'll get into the allegations involving Russia. He's facing 30 years in prison, leaving the US, traveling to Hong Kong. He was en route to another final destination where essentially he was in Russia and has stayed there in order to avoid being extradited to the United States, and where he remains today. Now, it's important we know, and we get into what are the reasons. Why did essentially he engage in such an action in this case? And I do like this quote because it's a broad explanation, as I'm about to explain in more detail what was going on. As he noted, I don't want to live in a world where everything that I say, everything I do, everyone I talk to, every expression of creativity or love or friendship is recorded. Now, what he was talking about was essentially the federal law in place here. Now, this particular act, it's one of these, as those of you who've been in my other lectures, one of these post 9/11 laws that essentially led to problems later on. This particular law was put in place to target foreigners suspected of terrorism abroad, outside of continental United States, for warrantless wiretapping. Now, as mentioned multiple times, the idea was this was to target non-US citizens, non-US personnel. But essentially, that's not what happened. In execution, and our government has admitted, we ended up spying on US citizens directly. And in particular, and this is where I'll get into some of the IT components here, the way the PRISM program worked. For example, if I am here in the United States and I emailed somebody outside of the United States who is potentially under some form of surveillance, my information would be recorded and stored. If I was talking to my own friends and family via email or phone, and somehow that data being held by Google or Facebook was transferred from a server in the United States to a server abroad, well, the NSA would grab all of that data. If I was on vacation with my wife and family in Italy and I spoke to people, my data potentially would be recorded as well. And, there's been a lot of stories that have come out essentially that while it had the intent to target foreigners, non-US citizens, non-US personnel, the large amount of data that was obtained was against us as US citizens. And also, too, the NSA would go to the FISA court in DC, and on an annual basis, on a single court order, they could get permission to spy and do warrantless wiretapping on average 125,000 targets. Now, I want to clarify, when we say targets, we're not talking about 125,000 known and suspected terrorists. We're essentially talking about anybody overseas, could be business personnel, teachers, human rights workers, healthcare workers, journalists writing about foreign affairs. All of them essentially could face this type of surveillance, and anyone in connection to them, including US citizens, was essentially having all of their data, including phone calls, photos, emails, you name it, recorded and stored. And also, I always like to point out, we always think about the NSA and the CIA when it comes to what Snowden engaged in. The FBI was also involved in this, as far as being involved with access to all this data that was being recorded and pooled. And we'll get into in a little bit later why that should worry you when you have the NSA, CIA, and the FBI essentially working together with this amount of data. Now, it's interesting that despite this happening in 2013, the court cases now are starting to come to fruition. And we had last year in US v. Moalen, the US Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit essentially took to task the NSA for engaging in this and made it very clear that the act I mentioned before, the Foreign Intelligence Service Act, they violated it by the actions that they engaged in particular with the telephone records. And I do like it as part of their ruling, they made it very clear. The NSA appears to have carte blanche when it comes to its investigative powers, and it often erases the thin line between reasonable searches and transgressions against individual privacy. They also wanted to make sure that Americans knew, as part of their ruling, how many phone calls were being recorded. Now, if this doesn't shock you as a number, I don't know what will. Over 600 million phone conversations recorded daily. I just want you to think about the scope of that. That's a lot of data. So with that said, now that we have an overview of who Edward Snowden is, what happened, what data was at stake, what happened to us as far as US citizens, our data being taken and recorded and stored, let's get to the heart of it. Should Edward Snowden be prosecuted, tried, potentially convicted, face 30 years in jail, or should he be pardoned? From the government position, these are the main points that the US government would put forward if he was here and going through a trial. Firstly, the government would say Edward Snowden has put himself out there as a hero, as a whistleblower. But as far as we know, there are no attempts by which he tried to report this illegality, this unlawfulness. We don't have any evidence that he went to his senior advisors at the CIA and tried to, report it to them, or then try to maybe hire a lawyer, try to go through a whistleblower petition or process, anything prior to releasing this information after taking it. From the US government's perspective, and me playing the US government, you can't claim to be a whistleblower if you did not take steps prior to engaging in such a catastrophic release of data, which in turn put the US security apparatus at risk. So that alone, we would hold the position as the US government, he doesn't get to call himself a whistleblower. Also, we don't fully know the extent of what he gave any other parties besides the reporters or potentially Russia. I do want to point out, if I'm playing the role of the US government, our position would be Russia's allowed you to stay Edward Snowden for an extended amount of time. Russia's not known for doing things for good reasons. In other words, you had to have given them something in order for them to allow you to stay. What did you give them? Because whatever it is that you did provide the Russian government, it secured your ability to stay in the country, and most likely it damaged the US security apparatus. And for that, you should be held accountable. Also, the US government, we would point out that besides the data pertaining to unlawful surveillance of US citizens and people abroad, there are millions of documents which were taken that we don't know the full fate of what happened to them. Could they be in Russian hands? Could they be turned over to other organizations like Wikileaks? We don't know. And the fact that that unknown remains, we can hold you, Edward Snowden, accountable for that. So our resolution as the United States is very simple. For us to fully know what you did, you need to return to the United States, face your prosecution, let us have the trial. You will have your opportunity to mount a defense. And if you're found innocent, so be it. But if we can show that you did engage in this activity that jeopardized the US security apparatus, that is in violation of the Espionage Act, then you should face the jail time that you rightly deserve. That essentially is a summary of the US government's position. It has not changed for the most part, though people have written to the United States government. You've had organizations reach out to see about trying to get a pardon. But as you can see, it's very straightforward and it's quite harsh, which then leads to our position that as the defense, and I'm going to play the defense role now, that Edward Snowden deserves a pardon. Firstly, if I was his defense counsel trying to approach the White House and secure a pardon for him, my position would be, look, thanks to him, we know that not just the United States, but the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Western democracies were busy capturing and storing our private information as citizens without our consent. If not for his actions, we may not have known this was taking place. He also, in terms of his intent, did not do this to get famous. He did not do this for monetary reasons. As a spy, he was not doing this for money or any type of favor. He did this in the public interest. And that's something, you know, we'll get to a discussion on intent in just a bit. But we have to consider that. If his intent was risking jail and or death for revealing this in the interest of US public interest and the world at large and their public interest, that should be considered here. Also, let's not forget, these methods are potentially unlawful and unconstitutional. That these programs, for most part, you know, are existing in one form or another. And we still are addressing these problems. As I mentioned, the court cases are still going on right now. He did reveal illegality. That should count for something in the sake of a pardon. Also, let's talk about the fact that how would he get a fair trial? Almost everybody within the United States government has vilified him to the nth degree. So the idea of trying to get a fair trial pretty much in any jurisdiction within the United States is essentially impossible, which leaves us the only option, which would be a pardon for the sake of he's already, you know, lived in Russia, lived in exile up to this point. You know, he's served a punishment. Also, the Espionage Act of 1917 is outdated and arguably may not fully apply here. Again, this was information not revealed for his own self-interest, for monetary or political gain. And as far as the whistleblower approach, let's not forget he was working for the CIA and was working for the NSA. Consider those agencies. Those are not agencies you generally want to whistleblow against. Those are the type of agencies, and you know, Edward Snowden was very upfront when he was speaking to the reporters from The Guardian and The Washington Post. He expected to either go to jail or possibly killed. You know, arguably, when this information was released in 2013, you know, Edward Snowden, I'm sure, was worried that arguably somebody from the CIA may come along and throw him off a balcony, and the story would have ended there. So it's unfair, if I was the defense counsel, to say to him, you know, yeah, you should, before you release this information, let's try to whistleblower approach. Let's try to get the CIA and NSA to realize the folly of their ways in this situation and make amends and change the program. Arguably, the defense position would be that's unrealistic, thus leaving a pardon as the only option here. Now, I do want to address Edward Snowden has given interviews where he's been asked about what did you give Russia? Whether it's true or not, we don't know. I'm going to be very clear. This is not a fact. This is essentially his statement, or statements, I should say. In September 2019, he stated, I haven't and I won't cooperate with Russia. Further, he added, I didn't cooperate with Russian intelligence services. I haven't and I won't. I destroyed my access to the archive. I had no material with me before I left Hong Kong because I knew I was going to have to go through this complex multi-jurisdictional route. So essentially his position from a defense standpoint was he knew he could end up somewhere in the world and stuck in amnesty if he was lucky, and he did not want to have information that could be used as leverage against him. He did provide that information to The Guardian and The Washington Post so they could analyze and vet. And I want to be very clear why that's very important. If you look at what happened with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks under Assange's leadership's view was gather all that data and just put it out there unredacted. The hell with the consequences if anybody, you know, who is hurt or killed or injured, because we believe in universal truth and we're going to put it out there. And that arguably led to a number of problems, casualties, people, facing dire consequences for, secret cables and intel information put out there in that format. Edward Snowden did not do that. He essentially trusted the data in the hands of the Guardian and the Washington Post. Now, again, that's his statement. That's also been backed up by the Guardian and the Washington Post. I'm not stating it's a fact. That's just essentially their position. Just want to be clear on that. So now we can open up to the group chat. I'm curious people's thoughts. What should we do? Trial and imprisonment, pardon? There's good arguments on both sides. I'll be very clear here. But I like to hear from the audience. What are we thinking?
Absolutely. So at this time, feel free, if you want to share, you're able to say trial and imprisonment or pardon in the chat. We'd be happy to hear some of your thoughts on that idea. You can also, someone said pardon and public Senate hearings. Pardon was another aspect in there. And then I do have some questions for you. One says trial, potential imprisonment. Another one says imprisonment. Someone said that he's a hero, pardon, and censure. So it's kind of looks like half and half, honestly, so far in terms of.
Now, believe it or not, I'm going to flip the script on you guys. And I'm curious about this view. I've had my colleagues who've also said, from the defense perspective, we should have a trial. If we have a trial, essentially the United States government and everything it was doing would essentially come out. And believe it or not, there are people who are angry at Edward Snowden, but would rather he get pardoned so he can shut up. Because the concern is if we do a trial, it has to be a public trial. And it would probably be extremely, well, to say it'll be political is an understatement, but the fact that it would reveal probably even further the fact that civil liberties were violated on a greater scale, that many in DC would probably say maybe the trial route at this point is not good. What do we think about that? The idea we should pardon him for the sake of we don't want to know what else our government did because it would embarrass the US government. I'm just checking out the chat room.
Yeah,
we have a very active chat.
Yeah, it's very active. There's a few questions too. And if while you're checking out the chat, Dr. Maggio, if anybody does have a question that they've popped in the chat that they definitely want me to get to, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. Yeah,
because some of these we're probably going to have to answer at the end. Like there's a question, if Russia has used any of the NSA CI. We don't know. We have suspicions. Any ransomware happening lately? We'll get to some of those. There's some good ones, but those need some special attention. So, Emily, what would you think as far as the breakdown here? You think we have like a half and half? Do we have more of a?
It really feels very half and half from what I can see. There's just a few people that have popped in there, and just so you know. Just so everybody knows, some people have replied to everybody and some people have only replied to hosts and panelists. So that's okay. You might not be seeing everything in the chat. But from what I can see, it looks pretty half and half. There's a few people in here that have mentioned, just pardon them. We don't need to know more about what happened. But that was only just like one or two people that chimed in to say that. I would say half and half. I think that's why it's a difficult conversation.
Well, let's we got a couple more points I want to cover, then we can get to questions, which I think will be good here. Upward and onward, as we say. So want to get to a couple points. As I mentioned before, intent here goes a long way. And I will be very clear, we should focus on the fact that he was not stealing data for money. He was not essentially acting as what we think of as spies, someone betraying their country. He was doing this in the public interest. And we have people, for example, Chelsea Manning, whose sentence was commuted, once President Obama, was given, a meeting about it, and they discussed, what was the intent, what was the interest. Similar to that, we have to, accept the fact that, he did not do this for personal gain. And that does factor in here heavily, and it should. Also, it's something I like to tell my students, just because it's, quote, legal does not make it moral. And there are plenty of laws throughout this nation's history that have been, quote, legal, but later, luckily, ended and removed because they were, quote, immoral. So the government's position at times that, well, what we were doing was, quote, legal at that time under the Foreign Surveillance Act does not always work as a trump card. Just because something's legal can still be problematic. And as I've mentioned, even in recent years, where these cases where people are challenging what happened under these surveillance programs, the federal court system is acknowledging, yeah, well, this is not legal. This is not moral. This is not the country we want to live in, where our data is being stored like this and potentially used against us. And that brings us to dangerous precedents. For those that are not familiar, the CIA is supposed to be able to spy on foreigners, not US citizens. The FBI, in turn, is the organization dealing within the United States serious crimes at a federal level. What happens when we have a program, a database, a pool of data that these organizations can basically share with one another, and those lines, those silos, you do not pass? I'm the CIA. I don't spy on Americans. We're the CIA. We're the FBI. We don't start getting around the need for warrants because we're going to, find information about people through this pooled data. That's dangerous. That and I'm not somebody who's soft on crime, but I don't like the idea that when any of these three-letter organizations cannot carry out a prosecution or an investigation or a surveillance through lawful means, they can essentially turn to these companies like Google, Facebook, and just take our data and weaponize it against us. That should bother you, as we discussed at the beginning with what Apple's doing now. And we've talked about, for those who've been in my other lectures, we've had some problems in terms of human rights in the war on terrorism, and we've made changes. This is one of those areas, in addition to us reversing our policy on torture and how we engage in fighting terrorism abroad and domestically. This is one of those areas that we should highly consider reform and how we maintain data privacy of US citizens. But also I want to add, with Edward Snowden, some food for thought. Right now, essentially, him being in Russia, he's a critic. And that's part of the reason why Russia's allowed him to stay, because it's embarrassing for Western democracies, the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, to have somebody who can show that government's engaged in this type of behavior. One of the arguments for him being pardoned is it would be better for him to return to the United States and be on the front line of guiding the development of how laws are written as to mass surveillance programs. And I also want to point out, Edward Snowden was not 100% against mass surveillance programs. Some of you who have followed his interviews with him, he even talked about he was working on projects against the Iranians, against Chinese hackers, where mass surveillance programs, if done lawfully, can stop these type of actions. And to be also clear, not to scare you, but we're already there, the United States, in terms of our cyber abilities, we're essentially a generation behind other countries compared to Russia, compared to China. So we need as many experts as we can to bridge the gap to get up to the level we need to be to fight these cyber wars. So having an individual like Edward Snowden in Russia criticizing what's going on here versus being here in the United States to be a political force, a driving force behind not only changes, but changes to the apparatus that can be effective to protect our country, that's something to consider. Now, as we're wrapping up here, some of you who have had previous lectures with me know I can't help myself. I tend to put something in humorous just to kind of, get us all before we go to Q&A, get us all on a level head. So emotions don't get out of control when we start asking questions. But if you've been in my other lectures, you've noticed I've kind of built a reputation where at least something I mentioned during my lecture ends up happening. So for those, and my students always remind me of my Notre Dameness of NCU predictions. For those that have been participating or viewed my other lectures, you may have remembered I talked about certain militia groups in the South, and we had discussions about could they engage in domestic terrorism, and the response was kind of, all that could never happen. Then a few days later, we had the January 6th storming the Capitol. Then I had the other lecture where I talked about counterterrorism measures and the use of concrete barriers, and I had people say, well, that really doesn't work. And then 2 days later, we had the gentleman who attacked the White House, ran the concrete barrier, and there was the shootout. Then I was talking about there's going to be an increase in cyber attacks and ransomware in one of my other lectures. We've had a lot of those problems. So I got to be honest, I want to end this lecture with a prediction I hope happens for the sake of all of us. So I'm predicting that I'm going to win 400 million in a lotto jackpot. I'm going to create an annuity to pay and fund graduate school for all the students at NCU, salary raises for faculty and staff, and I will be selfish. I'm going to use a portion of my money to open a Hawaiian-themed set of tiki bars, but they're also going to be pet adoption centers. So I'm testing out this concept. Yes, the dog does have a matching Hawaiian shirt compared to me, because that's how I roll. And with that said, I think we've reached the end. Here's my email for those of you who would like to email me. Phone number, that is my cell. Please call within reasonable hours. And keep in mind, I am on the East Coast. And with that said, let's open it up to the question and answer period.
Sorry, your dog is wearing the same shirt as you, and I just thank you for leaving us with that happy thought at the end of this.
If I can get him over here. That is not a prop dog. That is a real dog. Come here.
It is a real doggy.
Come on, this is your part of the show. Come on, up. And grab him here. There we go. There you are. See, yay.
Oh yes, hello.
Hello, everyone.
Couple of questions. Your dog is so cute.
We got to request somebody. Can we share info? Is there a way? Emily, would you be able to put or actually I could do it. I can put my information in the chat room.
I can put it in the chat. It's no big deal. I'll put your email in there real quick.
You want to type it? You want to put it in?
Yeah, I'll put it in there while you answer this question, because it came up a couple of times in the chat and then it popped up in the Q&A. So I want to make sure that we can get to this. It says from Siobhan, mentions Dr. Maggio, have you ever worked in national security? And so I guess someone is just kind of wondering a little bit more about your background.
I believe it or not, I worked as a private contractor. So I worked for a couple of different security firms, and I've worked on government projects, but no, I've never been a member of one of those agencies.
Okay. And just a little bit more about Dr. Maggio. He has a background in corporate law and compliance matters, also serves as an investigator and researcher to white-collar criminal activity, unlawful banking practices by terrorist organizations. So a little bit more about his law background. Oh, Dr. Hall says, are you Edward Snowden? Oh, wow.
No.
Okay. All right. Let's see.
I think I'm like 100 pounds heavier than the real Edward Snowden.
Well, you know, there's all kinds of surgeries out there nowadays. Okay, so Peter says he deserves a pardon, and this is just going back to whether deserves a pardon or trial, but a trial would be beneficial to stopping the big tech. Is there ever a chance that you think he'll come back from Russia?
I hope so. I mean, I got to be honest, if you look at, not to get political, even some of the pardons that have happened, and I'll be fair, under the last two administrations, there are people arguably that did not deserve a pardon. I think I even saw it in passing. There was Jared Kushner's friend that was in there that got a pardon recently. You know, there are people that have done far worse. that have gotten a pardon. I'll give you an example. 2018, Scooter Libby, who revealed Valerie Plame's identity as a CIA agent in order to get back at her husband, who was an ambassador. That's somebody who should not have been pardoned. And yet he was.
Someone just said in the chat, Little Wayne, the rapper, got a pardon. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. What is the power that allow a bilateral treaty between America and Russia?
In what, can we clarify in what
Derek,
aspect?
if you can clarify your question, that would be great in the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to move on to the next question.
Yeah, that needs a little, we need to flush that out a little bit.
No worries. Did last week's Fed report debunk your 1/6 prediction? Someone said in the Q&A. And I'm sorry, I didn't read that, so I can't comment on that. Any comments?
I don't, to be honest.
Okay.
I don't want to get
Cool.
too far off track.
Okay, cool. Someone wants to know a little bit more about, if you can discuss that there's no true defense to the Espionage Act.
Well, arguably, if you take the government's position that if you take data, you've taken data, that in other words, they would view it as strict liability.
Okay. Let me see here.
And
Okay.
even if he tried to have a trial, that's something the government would hammer. That look, regardless of his intent, he still broke the law. Breaking the law for good reason does not generally get you a free pass. It's kind of like if I knew there was a rapist, child molester, and he was living, on my block, and I kick in his door and kill him. Okay, well, yeah, he was a terrible human being. I still broke the law. I'm held accountable for that.
And Derek did expand. I think maybe I just read it wrong. Derek mentioned, does America ever sign a bilateral agreement with Russia? If so, why would Russia refuse to turn Snow over?
No, we do. I mean, but again, Russia's perspective is they're not per se, quote, turning him over. It's just they've given him amnesty. They're not holding him against his will. He could get on a plane in the United States right now if he wanted to. It's just that they've given him the right to stay in the country for as long as he wants.
Thank you, Dr. Maggio. Do you know if anybody in our espionage community has lost their lives as a result of the information that Snowden shared? Are you aware of that?
Not that I know.
Okay.
I will be honest though, there have been a couple of incidents where I think the Guardian, they quote redacted information and they printed it in the newspapers, but people realized if they rephotocopied it the right way, you could see what was through the black ink redacted info, which even Edward Snowden's admitted, look, I bear responsibility for that they didn't redact information. I will say with the WikiLeaks situation, there are more incidents of people who have been injured or killed due to that mass dump of information.
Let me see a couple more things. Peter asked in the Q&A, if there was a trial, would government officials be arrested?
Depends on the government officials. Certain members of the White House or Congress have immunity. As generally what happens, not if you look at history, when the government gets in trouble for doing something unlawful, usually, I don't like to use the term scapegoat, but somebody ends up with the liability. So that's a good question. Who would end up with the liability on this?
There's so many things in the chat. I want to get to a couple of them if I can. Do you know if there's a statute of limitations for this kind of crime?
For this, no. I mean, they can. He can't wait it out. I'll put it that way. It's if.
Okay. And then I'm sorry, I'm scanning. There's quite a bit. And then.
I know some people. I'm seeing a few of them about Julian Assange. I look. I understand for the WikiLeaks people. Maybe that's the next lecture we do.
Right.
But how he approached revealing data is very different from Edward Snowden. You can't put the two together in the same way.
Okay. And then let me see what else. Do you think that the impact from trial would be far worse? Sorry, my little kid just went underneath there. Would be far worse disclosing the data from him just being silent? I guess someone wants to know a little bit more how you.
I think it would be very
Yeah.
embarrassing to the United States. And even some of the things that Edward Snowden would testify to, and some of it, if you've watched any of his interviews, he even has talked about, for example, he would come into the office where they were doing work and they would have like, they'd printouts of nude photos of whoever they were doing surveillance on, like, oh, check this out. Things like that are not going to play well with the American public. You know, to know that our information, our data is essentially being viewed in this way. Those are things the government does not want people to know.
Someone has shared that they spent a lot of time in IC, including when the Snowden incident happened. It seems like just shared that some of the information that you've shared may be incomplete. And I mentioned if anybody has any questions or wants to have more conversation with Dr. Maggio, he'll be happy to do so.
Yeah, and again, this, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, there's no way for me to cover every specific violation of the Foreign Intelligence Act. I did not cover all the specific IT aspects just for the sake of time. So if anybody wants to get into more of the specifics, or I want to learn more about X, Y, and Z part of the lecture, I'm happy to provide that.
Absolutely. And I did post Dr. Maggio's email in the chat, but there's a couple people that had mentioned, like, do you think he'll ever come back from Russia? And some people mentioned in the chat that they don't even think he has a desire to come back to USA. And then Dr. Hall mentioned no one knows the full story except those with a top secret or higher clearance who has a need to know. Let's see. I'm trying to see if there's anything else.
Yeah, and to go back to that point, that's one of those things 30 years from now, when, you know, things get declassified and we're watching the History Channel, we'll learn about, okay, this is what actually occurred. You know,
that's true.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So it may not be on the History Channel for those watching I turned on the History Channel recently because we got a new cable package. Almost everything was about aliens and ghosts. I was getting very frustrated.
Okay.
Did aliens build DC? No.
My goodness.
Save you the 40 minutes of that Ancient Aliens program for those who were going to watch that episode.
Someone just posted in the chat, Snowden's video posting shows he wants to come back, but doesn't think he ever will be allowed back without going to jail. So I do have to say, if there's any other questions about the presentation, please feel free to post those now. Obviously, any other general conversation.
No, we're up to 90 in the chat room. I apologize, people. I have not had a chance to
you can't
read
catch
that
up
many
with
messages.
all of that. I know, my goodness. And I don't think that there's.
Where were all of you when I had my lecture on torture? I had like 10 people respond.
I know.
I mentioned nude photos being looked at. Everyone's like, the hell with this. Like,
I know, right?
you push my buttons now. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
But I do appreciate it. That I will review them. I get a chance there.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a Rubik's Cube question. Oh my goodness. Oh, forgive me. It says, is the Rubik's Cube part of the movie accurate? I'm so sorry. I don't know what that's in context to.
Oh, I understand the movie. I'll be honest, I don't know if that's true. That may be dramatic license. I don't have the confirmation on that. There's in the movie by Oliver Stone, he's playing with the Rubik's Cube, and then he uses that in order to get information out.
Oh, okay, that's how he's talking.
I'll be honest, I do not know if that is true.
comment in the chat was timing is everything. I just watched the movie Snowden night before last. My computer must have been watching this would pop up next. Oh my goodness. Well, I do have to say thank you so much for everybody in the chat. All of your conversation has been really wonderful. I will pass this on to Dr. Maggio so we can review it. But again, if you have any further questions or just want to have more conversation about this webinar, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Maggio. I know he'll entertain any questions and carry on dialogue with you about it. It's certainly a fascinating topic. And as always, Dr. Maggio, we thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Everybody take care.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.